Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday ongoing coaching meeting. Glad that you're here today. As you know, we're in a series where we're bringing in quite a few outside voices just to encourage us and challenge us. And you guys are in for a special treat today because my good friend, I'd consider him a mentor. He's often called me crazy, and I feel like I've inherited some of my craziness from following Roy in the early days. Roy Moran is here. Many of you know him. He doesn't probably need much of an introduction. I've talked a lot about him and he's joined us before, but he's written a great book called Spent Matches. If you haven't read that, I would go buy that right now and I would read it. It's the first book I read as I was introduced to disciple making movements, and I tried to contact Roy. I don't know if Roy, I was in the middle of it or if I finished it first, but I was like, I've got to call this guy. And so I call Roy up, and he's been a friend and mentor and connector, resourcer ever since. He's also a pastor. Some of you guys may not know, he's pastor of a church, started the church called Shoal Creek Community Church in Kansas City, Missouri. He's known as the hybrid church guy. If you read Spent Matches, you'll know why. And he mentors and trains people all over the world. And he's in Slack. So you guys need to get in Slack if you're not already, because you can @ Roy. He just may respond. Roy, just recently, I think somebody was saying something about a quote, and then they replied to it, and then you replied to them, and they're like, I cannot believe the author just replied to me. It's like, so anyway, Roy, we're so glad you're here. You guys, I've asked Roy just to talk to us about the habit cycle. Roy, they may not be familiar with that language yet, so I'd love you to introduce them to that language.
Sure.
They'd be familiar with the DMM cycle we went through in lesson 8 of the training, but I want them to see this. It's called, you guys, a habit cycle that Roy and the New Generations team put together. And then in addition to that, he put something in Slack recently that I think all of you would find very helpful if you missed it. And it's basically the cycle, but it's got resources with it that could help you. So I think today's going to be really helpful, really practical. Roy, I think 30,000 feet always helps us again remember, okay, what are we doing here? Where are we at in the cycle? Where are we trying to go? So Roy, love you, brother. Glad you're here.
Hey.
Thanks for sharing with us.
Always good to be with you, Chris. Man, we don't get to spend enough time together. I remember fondly that the day you called. I was on vacation actually, and it was early in the morning, and I was up in northern Arkansas, and this fire-breathing guy was on the other end of the phone. Just couldn't. I mean, it was amazing. So I've loved every minute of it, man. Thank you so much for bringing me into your life and all that I've learned from you guys there at eLife. It's been incredible. So what's the time frame here? About an hour? Is that what we're looking at? Or
sure, Roy. Yeah, between you sharing and some Q&A, we can go an hour. Would be great.
All right.
Yeah.
So let me. I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll start with this. Chris, you referenced it, and just a little bit about process here. I'm going to babble on, and I can babble on for a long time unless you stop me. So if you have questions, you want to throw them in the chat, or you want to try to raise your hand or wave at your screen or whatever to get my attention, you feel free to. And I am not going to be offended one bit if you stop me along the way and you redirect. Couple of things that really fuel me. One is that in a learning environment, a teacher doesn't have a need to teach, but a learner does have a need to learn. So that's why you bring the agenda and not me. I maybe bring some suggestions and you set the agenda, because you're the one that brings the need to this. And second is, if you've ever been around me a lot, you'll sort of wonder, does that guy not ever have anything new to say? And it's because I believe in Patrick Henry's famous phrase. You probably know he's famous for a phrase, right? Anybody know what Patrick Henry's famous for? His phrase? Come on. Give me liberty or give me death, right? All right. So I like another one of his, and that is, he says, people need to be reminded more than they need to be informed. So that's why I repeat myself a lot. It's not because I'm old or I'm losing my mind. It comes from a big why, big strategies here. So here's the habit cycle. This really, I owe all of this to Ila Tassi. If you were to look at his DMM cycle that he has on the wall in Nairobi at the Lifeway Center, you would see some real familiarity with it. It's maybe one distinct difference in it that exists, but through repeated travels into the Eastern Africa world and understanding what they did, how they did it, and how they became the caretaker of 30 movements that God had started through their activity in that realm, I began to distill just what was going on there and wonder how I could transport it here. So the cycle is basically kind of each of those icons is basically a toolbox that exists, and it really has 4 different levels to it. And the idea, if you know, when we use a flywheel analogy, that's not always apparent to people what a flywheel is. But if you think about the most common illustration I think of is a potter's wheel. Not many people work on a potter's wheel that's manually driven today, but at one point there was this huge stone that sat at the bottom, stone disc that sat at the bottom of a potter's wheel, connected all the way up to the plate. And the potter would have to use their foot to get it started, and it would be hard at first, really, really, really hard. But over time, if you kept pushing and pushing and pushing, it got easier and easier and easier, because the principle of that large weight, it stores energy. And the same thing is true in movement. Small repeated acts, perseverance, faithfulness, habits actually store energy, and that's the pressure that the Spirit uses to spawn movements. And so we saw that in the whole world of discipling there, someone would be in a discovery group and they would become a disciple, begin living and discover that God wants them to be his child, and they would have this John 1:12 moment where they began to live into all that Jesus did in the cross and stuff. And that wasn't always visible. Sometimes that was almost invisible in terms of when that happened, how that happened and stuff. But they discovered that person then, once they became a disciple, needed another second level of training. So let's think of the discovery group that they were in, learning to read the Bible for themselves, hear from God, obey it, and share it with their friends as level 1 training. Level 2 was, how do I give that away? How do I become a disciple maker? And so they had developed a training for everyone that was in their discovery groups to teach them how to give away this, how to repeat the process again, which was really new to me because I had really understood movement in terms of someone gets involved in a discovery group, and that discovery group multiplies, and that multiplies, and that multiplies and multiplies. And I began to realize that movements have a large amount of training inside them. That one of the ligaments that holds the action together is this really equipping, mentoring, helping people begin to expand their vision and understand. So this level 2 was becoming a disciple maker. But I discovered they also had this third level of training, and what they discovered is that when people got to multiplying a group, that was one level of complexity that people had. They could multiply a group, but there was a third level of complexity that they needed to train them in, is that was when they helped their groups multiply groups. And so they had this third level of training of becoming a multiplying disciple maker along the way. And then as that happened, so I think all of you should have read Chris's book, one of the tomes of movement, one of the greatest daggers to the megachurch there is, and in a good way, in a godly way, let's say. No, but there was this. You all have seen Beheze's diagram, the diagram of the guy that he was working in the money changing, the currency exchange, and meeting with all these truck drivers, had all this time, started doing discovery with them, and then physically and literally the gospel began to spread from that South African embassy there in Burundi. So Bahisi became a country leader. So out of all of it, that disciple making movement, he went through those processes of learning to be a disciple maker, multiplying disciple. Not a trained Christian vocation person at all. So he was just an ordinary person. So now he's a country leader, and he needs another level of training as a movement catalyst. And so he's connected into a group that meets on a quarterly basis with Isla Tassi, the 12 to 15 Eastern Africa leaders that are now multiplying down into Southern Africa that meet on a regular basis to learn from one another. So this cycle has a kind of a focus to it. Let me see, I can get down to the bottom here. If we think about this, in terms of movement, right now at New Generations, this is one of our key things is we're realizing that movements have to be wide. That is that there's going to be lots of numbers to them. They have to be deep. There's got to be quality there. And then you get it to be long. Then you get it to go to those 13, 15, 28, 30 generations. So it when it meets barriers and obstacles, it can hop over those and keep moving. And so a piece of that, is understanding the kind of culture that you're building in this process. So I'm going to just stop there for a second, because I'm going to pivot to the center of this thing for a moment, because it relates to our culture, Western culture, and why that sits there as opposed to why it doesn't sit in their culture. So any questions or thoughts or?
Roy, I haven't seen anything in the chat yet, but tell me again. So when I've seen the diagram that you say Isla put together, that this was kind of derived from, did he put that together in recent years, or is that just what they started experiencing early on, and so that came out pretty early, or that was more of a later development that then the rest of New Generation saw, hey, it seems like a similar cycle in other places?
Yeah, I would say it's at least 10 years old. So, and I could, if I took the time, I could show you the development of it as it developed across time. But early on, Isla, more than any other movement leader I've met in the world, has a systemic type mind. And so he really does sort of embody this James Clear thing. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. He gets that. And so he builds systems. He builds these systems with people across time. So he's been doing that for quite some time in terms of identifying what he would call the irreducible minimums of this. And so this would inform what they would do when they enter into a space and how they would start and those kinds of things.
That makes sense. Did he call it, Roy, what word did he use for this? Is it habits to him, or what did he call his cycle?
He calls it the DMM cycle. Yeah. I could, I'm not going to waste time to find it, but I got a recent picture. I was there this June. And I would encourage anybody on the call here, the second week in June, Isla and I host a global DMM Catalyst Camp. And it's an incredible week. It's not driven by speakers. It's driven by cases of movement. So there's 4 cases every week. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, each have a case study, and you get put in a coaching group, and that coaching group becomes a coach for this case study. And so some of the case studies are like last year, one of our case studies was purposely a failure, complete failure. And so, we spent time, 3 hours just going through what was right, what was wrong, what was missing, what lacked clarity. How would you create a roadmap for this team to get back on track? And some of them are, most of them are rousing successes and that kind of stuff. So, but it's a great place to come and see up close and personal, some movement catalysts and how they think and what they're doing. All right. Any other questions? I'm going to move on if there's not.
I think we're good, Roy.
All right. So one of the things that we added to this that wasn't there, and so when I began to work in the North American environment, I was asking myself, there's a lot of work been done. Dave Hunt at City Team International trained in 35 different states, thousands and thousands of people. Hermie Schmidt, they did a lot of work in the U.S. and very little traction, very little generational growth. We saw some early on in the Hispanic world, and it was kind of amazing, but unfortunately, it fell to what a lot of things fall to in the West, and that was that there was a unicorn in the middle of it. And once that unicorn gets a little wacky, then the whole thing just disappears on you. So as we began to think about this, we began to realize that most of the training that had been developed for DMM in the world had been developed for cross-cultural teams. And it was meeting a specific purpose. And so it was delivering to them people who had sold their goods and left their families behind and gone to some of the hardest places for the sake of Jesus to give people hope that had no other hope in any other way. And so as a result of that, the training targeted them, and it also targeted them. Most of them existed in a team, and so as we began to ask ourselves and spend a lot of time with Dave Hunt, kind of unpacking what they did, why they did it, what the impact was, why he thought that things didn't work. And so one of the things we realized is that we were delivering this training to people who didn't have the heart that the other trainings had been developed for. We were delivering this training to people who had grown up on a forgiveness-based gospel, people who thought of the cross as a finish line, not as a starting point. And so in many ways, my first 5 years, I found myself floundering, training people, and not getting much traction, and seeing the typical results of what people had of that. One in 100 people might become a practitioner, and so that whole frustration. I realized that that in the West we didn't have a training problem, but we had a cultural problem. So we had to back up the training to put God's heart in the middle of this thing, and base everything that we do out of the heart of the Father, so that people are re-gospeled into a multiplicative mindset. And you could train them to go out, and you could train them to invite their neighbors to do discovery and all this kind of stuff. But a couple of things happened. One is they got discouraged quickly, and second is they experienced fear very quickly in terms of opposition or anything like that. And so we just realized that we were working with Christians who weren't captured by a true sense of a kingdom gospel. And so we began to work hard at the beginning of our training to get people to understand who the Father was. And we wanted a picture of the Father standing on the edge of town like Jesus drew in Luke 15. And we wanted everyone to understand that God has been about family from the moment we see him in the pages of Genesis and till the end of the book of Revelation. God has been about building a family. And Jesus shows the heartache and the true sense of joy of the Father standing on the edge of town, waiting for his son to come home. When his family gets built, the Father, does backflips, throws a party. And so that heart became a real rallying cry for us to be able to say, let's help people understand a new way of thinking about the gospel, that the cross is really a starting point and it's not a finishing point. And so, as we dealt with ordinary, average, everyday followers of Jesus, we had to realize that their understanding of the gospel had to be elevated before we even started talking to them about multiplication and discipling and those kinds of things. And so that was a gut punch to me, in that sense, because I realized that the raw materials at which I was dealt was different than the raw materials that, say, Isla is dealt when they're working in a Muslim village and people began to follow Jesus. There's an all-out total commitment, surrender, the whole thing, because there's no sense of a gospel that's anemic, that was preached about forgiveness and just gets my sins forgiven and gets me into the kingdom and gets my eternity set. That doesn't have a full orb sense of that God is building a family, and the reason I'm in the family is to help him find my not yet brothers and sisters that belong in the family. And that's my reason for existence in this world. So that was a hard pill for us to swallow, that to believe that we had to go backwards to go forwards in that process. Again, I'm going to take a deep breath here.
Roy, let's talk about that some. I know people are staring at the diagram and have some questions about things in the diagram, but before we get to the rest of the diagram, talk about this. You talk about it some in your book, and I think it's really helpful, especially in our context. How did you differentiate between like the forgiveness gospel and the kingdom gospel, or something like that? The gospel of salvation, gospel of the kingdom. I don't remember, but can you explain that a little bit more again, and why the gospel that's so often proclaimed here doesn't naturally lead to the things that the gospel that the people Isla's working with results in it naturally leading toward?
Yeah, let's do it in two different levels. First, from a cultural level, the gospel here, it really doesn't cost me much. It's all about me. God loves me. Jesus died for me. The Holy Spirit fills me. It's all about me in that sense. And there's a piece of that that's true, but it costs me nothing to throw my allegiance toward Jesus. And in fact, I can probably put my allegiance in Jesus and exist in a space where I'm not required I don't have the kinds of relationships that really do see my life and hold me accountable for allowing Jesus to leak deep into my soul. In that context, just the mere allegiance to Jesus costs a lot. And so there's this, at the cross, I'm using allegiance here. That comes in I've got a few mentors in this. Scott, oh my gosh, my old brain is the gospel.
Yeah, King Jesus gospel or something.
Jesus gospel. Yes,
Scott McKnight.
Scott McKnight. Thank you so much. I couldn't remember his last name. Scott McKnight. Matthew. Can't remember his last name. Gospel Allegiance. The gospel something or other. He's got some really good stuff, and they've all infused my thinking about this whole area to help me understand that. And I think it's simply, I love James Kung, guys with the InterVarsity, has a presentation of what we would think of the gospel, but his is 4 circles. And it's this idea of created for good, damaged by evil, transformed for better, sent to heal. And so his presentation of the gospel, the kingdom gospel, that's the closest thing I've seen of very short gospel presentations that really does embody what I'm speaking to here, in the sense is that there is a matter of allegiance that comes at the cross. And I don't believe, and we could spend several hours on this. I don't believe that it comes even close to damaging the idea of works and grace and all that kind of stuff. I think that that allegiance that I owe to Jesus is coming to believe that I'm in a kingdom and I'm the king. I'm now pledging allegiance to a new king and his kingdom. And I can't have the kingdom without the king. And oftentimes we offer people the kingdom, peace and purpose and meaning and all kinds of things without the king, without this idea of allegiance to Jesus, that what he says matters most. And that's what's happening here is that you're exchanging a life of self-worship for a life of Jesus worship. And not that it has to be, long and drawn out and that kind of stuff, but whatever, we're calling people to needs to have that sense of allegiance to it.
I think that's helpful, Roy. Yeah. And I think that is a real difference between our context and others, not only because of the background of the various peoples, but also because of how it's presented.
Yeah.
Seems like the king piece or the Lord piece is going to be more consistently presented in some contexts than others. You and I know about the theological debates of the past that came out of some certain seminaries where lordship was almost removed as a part of this. And so, I love that you're starting here. We have a few questions, Roy, but they relate to the words on here. So maybe before I pose them to you, you can tell us what the words mean, and then we'll see if their questions still apply.
So the cycle here works, in a sense, is that there was a creator God, who was building a family, and he started this family, Adam and Eve, and it broke really quickly, and so we see, the first half of the Bible is just a series of working through this nation of Israel to get there. But we would draw a line coming down on this diagram and put a cross in the middle of that heart as we would explain it. And as we engage with his heart and we understand how much he loves us, and we realize what he did for us to give us the right to become children of God, we engage in a relationship of submission and surrender. Oftentimes some people will refer to that as prayer. We don't want that to be a particular time of the day or that kind of stuff. We want that to be a relationship that we learn that our Father wants to hear from us and he wants to speak to us. And so we began to gain this habit of prayer. And I was talking to a guy yesterday who was he's an ultra marathoner, and he said, I'm looking at these characteristics of disciple makers and catalysts, and I see that they pray 2 hours a day. And he says, man, my wife and I, we've got to up our prayer. And I said, so Andy, what do you do when you run 3.5 hours a day? And he says, well, most of the time I pray. I said, so if I'm writing about you, I might say, hey, there's this catalyst, lives in the southeast part of the U.S. and he prays 3.5 hours a day. It's like, he goes, oh yeah. But that idea of prayer becomes not just a block on my schedule, but it becomes a posture that I develop with God. And so we begin to pray. And so we teach people, each of these is a toolbox. So we'll give people simple, prayer calendar, to text their friends and different, tools and techniques. And that's what on that document that Chris was talking about earlier. It's kind of a toolbox of often, helping people wade into this relationship of prayer with the Father. And then we engage the lost world. Disciple making movements are all about the lost. They're not about making Christians better. I have a running conversation with some folks about, they think they have disciple making movements, but they're just making Christians better. They're reading all this stuff and multiplying into the church and that kind of stuff. But the idea came out of engaging the lost, and so we begin to ask ourselves, where's God called us? We want people to have a circle of accountability. We want them to draw a circle on a map or around a group of people where they're going to take responsibility for lostness, and they're going to engage those people. They're going to find ways to reorganize their life, their world, if it's social, whatever, to be with those folks and around those folks, and engage with those people. So, and then as they're doing that, we're looking for spiritually interested people. We're trying to find what Luke refers to as a person of peace, someone who is already got some momentum, spiritual momentum, someone that God's already working with, someone that shows an interest and also has a social network that they can take this gospel to. And so we have eyes, and we invite people, these people into discovery. So we would invite them to a discovery group where we would begin to share our journey with them, not our faith necessarily, not a set of propositions, but we invite them into our narrative, our story, and we began to read the scriptures together and find out what God has to say about life. And that discovery group over time, it will do two things. There will be a fair amount of people will drop out, and they won't be the people, a person of peace. They won't be some, but some will. And as they grow, they'll multiply, and we'll help them start a group of their own into their own particular social network. And as that grows and multiplies, ultimately, we see that ecclesia begins to take place, that there's these assemblies of people who are now embracing the cross, and they are Jesus followers. They've taken God up on the opportunity to become his child. And those assemblies then begin to develop over time, and they have a culture of multiplication. And so that toolbox on multiply is how do we sustain these assemblies in such a way that they multiply as well. And so this circle just keeps moving back around. And so we see this as a rubric that for all of our teams, everybody, if they're having a team meeting, they're just asking, what do we need this time? Do you need to raise the banner of discovery, or do we need to pray? Do we need to learn more about engaging and figure out some tools for better engaging spots in our city that aren't engaged? And so we just keep moving around and around and around. So I don't know if that was a clear explanation of the words or not, but if not, feel free to unmute and ask.
Roy is great. His question was related to then the other words there, from disciple to disciple maker on up, and how that relates to the habits that you just went through.
Well, and those would relate to different levels of training that people would receive on the basis of what's happening. So at the disciple level, they're in a discovery group. At that disciple maker level, they're beginning to multiply. And so they're figuring out how do they facilitate their own discovery groups. At the multiplying disciple level, they are people who have seen discovery groups multiply, and maybe even some of them become assemblies, some of them become ecclesia, but now they're trying to figure out what's it like to lead as a third generation person. So I'm a grandparent, and my grandkids started school today. And I know that's a monumental moment for parents and stuff. Not a big deal for me. I'm a grandparent, so I don't have a picture of my kid on the steps going, and first day of school and that kind of stuff. But I've had a lot of influence on my kids, and so they're doing that with their kids, and so it's that level of understanding, what it starts to mean to be catalytic. To be catalytic is to realize that it can't happen without you. You can't sit in an ivory tower and send epitaphs out, and you got to be there. But this is the judo move in being a catalytic disciple maker, and that is that it cannot depend on you. And that's where most of us mess up. Most of us, we've grown up in a type of Christianity that has taught us to be unicorns, and people look at us. I had a conversation a couple of days ago, the guy trying to get his group to multiply, and he said, they just won't do it. And I said, yeah, they won't do it because you're asking them to do what you do, and they're not you. And so you've got to reposture yourself. You're too strong in this group. Your temperament, your personality, your passions, and everything are working against you being able to multiply. And so that's when we find some of our best multipliers. And if you came to the Catalyst camp, you would see that firsthand when you see a lady who's virtually blind and she's got 8 generations and 38 churches that she's planted out of this thing. And she's this quiet, unassuming lady. And there's no personality power that's going to push that for her. It's the Spirit of God and the power of the Word of God happening. And in the West, we've been taught to be unicorns. So,
Roy, let me even go bigger picture. So as you're working with people across North America, doing a lot of training, talking to people about the habits, we're doing the same. People on this call mostly are working in North American context. There's some others working internationally. What would you say? What is your opinion, I guess, of the status of implementation of DMM principles like this in North America? What are some exciting things you're seeing? And then what's still challenging, do you think, in this context, as people are wanting to do what it's talking about here and be on this journey and implement it in their context? But, some are having some real success, others are struggling. From your vantage point, since you're kind of seeing things across North America, what's the status? What's going well? What's a challenge right now as it relates to living out these habits?
Well, I think that's a tall task there. I would say that the status is bleak in many ways. There's a lot of activity, but there's not a lot of generational productivity. So I see a lot of people getting to first generation, even second generation. And when I say generation, I'm talking about churches. I'm not talking about disciples. A lot of people will count, so-and-so disciple, so-and-so disciple, so-and-so. I'm thinking of it in groups. So I'm seeing, I want to start counting generations at the church level, not at the personal level. And I don't think we see hardly any of that going on in different spaces. There are some situations where there's kind of a judo move with calling groups churches and stuff, and it's like when you start to put the litmus test to it, you begin to realize it's not a one-to-one correlation to what you might find in South Asia or Southeast Asia or even in Africa and stuff. So I do think that there's a couple of things there that are a problem, and I'm gonna, it goes back to this gospel thing that I think maybe a prescription, Chris, to what you're talking about. If I'm trying to spread a virus, which we all have become very aware of how a virus spreads, I've got to be close enough in proximity. I've got to be there long enough, and I've got to have the virus strong enough. And when those 3 things match up, at that point, I can have viral transmission. And I would say that in the U.S., in the West, our gospel is not strong enough. We are still in a stage where we feel like the gospel gives us a reason to exist in someone's world. And unfortunately, the tide has passed us by. We are no longer in home field advantage. And people look at us, Christians, church in general, and they have a very negative image of who we are. Now, that doesn't mean they still don't think positive about Jesus, God, and the Bible. And if we can posture ourselves differently, I think we can be radically effective. But if we feel like that this good news that we have gives us a reason to exist in their world, it's difficult, to have that virus pass along. So I would say that, like for instance, I got a friend, guy in Hilo, Hawaii, who's a concrete contractor, and he is just a genuinely loving guy and had loved on all of the people that he hires and stuff like that, and stuff. And so when we began to help him understand how he can invite them, into reading the Bible and discovering what God has said about life, because he had such a deep relational connection with people, he started to have a profound spiritual connection with them well. And so, I mean, it just months out of the block, he's baptizing people. I'm getting pictures of people being baptized in bathtubs and marriages being, brought back together and all kinds of things, because of that. But he had a pretty deep relational connection with those people. I find most Americans, I mean, they rarely even know their neighbors' names. In the book Bowling Alone, the author does a little quiz and says, I give you $50,000 to reduce the crime in your neighborhood. I'll give you two choices, hire a police officer or design a program that would teach all of your neighbors to know each other's first names, which will work. And obviously, it's a trick question, because you would think I'll choose the 50 grand, but it's actually, if neighbors know each other's first names, crime goes down in a neighborhood. I mean, that is a spiritual truth. That is a thing in heaven as it is on earth type thing, in a sense, is that there's humanity. So I find that a lot of people are struggling, in the West, thinking that they can use the same types of things that happen in the East. So when Isla will take a water team into a space and dig a well, takes a lot of time, a lot of relationships built during that time when that well is being dug, and especially if it's being dug by a manual process, it really takes a lot more time, and it's perfect, and a lot of things happen in that. And we find ourselves pretty socially scarce, and so our social networks are very, very thin, and so the gospel has a hard time moving within those types of spaces. So I would say that's my maybe thought about the U.S. I would say a couple other things, and one is that we are people who are addicted to success. And what I love about the folks on this call, you guys, many of you have been at it for a long time, and you've stayed hard at it. And most people don't realize that when a group of, like, Miraculous Movements, the book, when that started, I mean, that had a long history, and the book itself doesn't start counting history until 2008. But there are 6 to 8 years before that all kinds of things are happening before that thing really comes out of the ground and you begin to get that story. And as Americans, I don't know if there's any Canadians on here, but even as Canadians, we have a hard time staying at things that long and it not being successful. So I love this quote here by Bruce Lee. I fear not the man who's practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who's practiced one kick 10,000 times. I mean, that spirit, of discipline and just staying after it and learning and and evaluating why it didn't work. We get so personally involved and hurt and tired and fatigued, and it's all about us, and we just don't have that evaluation type process to build a culture to say, okay, what did I learn? I failed miserably, but what did I learn? What did I learn here? Let's talk about that. Let's see if somehow we can learn to love people better next time. And that spirit of success is something that just is a cancer. And I think a lot of times we're like fish who don't feel wet. We don't realize that we've grown up in it. And I was talking Sunday to someone that says, well, I've been at this for 6 months, and really nothing's happened. And I said, well, when you've been at it 6 years and nothing's happened, come back and talk to me. Then I'll feel like you've really tried. But 6 months is nothing, come on. But I think I got a bunch of stuff here, but we get down into this conscious incompetence phase, and we get all discouraged in the pit of despair, and it's really hard for us to realize it's just natural. Everything we've ever learned, there has been this moment of tension, this moment of incompetence that we feel, and we avoid that like the plague. I don't want to feel stupid, but I gained a new friend the other day, and he was telling me his values, and he says he's a consultant, and I said, well, what do you do? He says, I walk in the room stupid. And it was like, I said, what? He said, I walk in the room stupid. I want to be the stupidest person in the room. I said, yeah, but they're paying you to be the smartest person in the room. He says, no, they're not. They're paying me to be the stupidest person in the room. They're paying me to be curious. They're paying me to ask questions. They're paying me to get probably they have the experience. I just have the ability to be the new person here. And it's like he's purposely embracing incompetence. And we have a hard time doing that. That is not American by any sense of the imagination.